I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation as part of the York Festival of Ideas, which forms part of a series delving into what it means to be human and exploring the nature of our humanity. My name is Vicky Johnson and I work as the Canon Precentor at York Minster, overseeing the cathedral's worship and prayer life. And I'm really delighted to welcome this evening His Honour Canon Peter Collier QC. Peter was born and brought up in the East Riding of Yorkshire. He read law at university and became a barrister, spending nearly 40 years practising at the bar in Yorkshire before becoming a judge and seeing out 11 years as the Recorder of Leeds before retirement in 2018. Having spent a lifetime practising and judging the law, he is spending some time in retirement looking at where all that law came from. A committed Christian and a reader in the Anglican Church, he wants to understand how his faith relates to current issues being debated in the public square, particularly those that have a bearing on justice and rights. He also has an interest in the world of ecclesiastical law and continues to play an active role as an Anglican ecclesiastical judge. Welcome, Peter, and over to you.
The day on which we're recording this is the anniversary of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. In recent months, the deaths of George Floyd and Sarah Everard 3 months ago in Clapham, in their different ways, have led to people talking about human dignity. It's said that Black people and women have the same right to life and the same right to walk unafraid in the streets of London as anyone else. The reason being that men and women, Black and white, all share one common human dignity from which those rights and so much else flow. The questions I want to address in the next half hour are: where does that understanding of human dignity come from? And what does it mean for our living in this world? Over the last 3 millennia, people have attempted in different ways to articulate what it means to be a human being and what it is that gives me as an individual any real meaning. And it's out of that understanding that any sense of the rights and responsibilities of individuals has emerged. I want to begin with a reasonably quick canter through some of the ideas that have been expressed. We shall see some similarities and some differences in the way that different thinkers have understood the idea of human dignity and related concepts. If we go back to classical times, then Cicero is as good a person as any to start with. He was a prolific writer on many issues. But I'm only aware of one instance of his using the idea of the dignity of humankind. He spoke of humankind as a whole being treated with dignity by virtue of their being different from the animals. It was reason that he said set humans apart from animals. Further, humanity shares that ability to reason with the gods. And so it is that we can understand the natural law which also arises from reason. Because we all have reason and natural law in common, we belong to a community and have duties to one another. But we should note that this did not produce any idea of equality. In Cicero's society, there was no equality as we would think of it. Slavery was regarded as a necessity, with perhaps 30 to 40% of the population of Rome being slaves in his lifetime. Other social distinctions, even among those who were freemen, were considered necessary for the proper functioning of the state. Freeborn women had no right to vote and could not hold public office. So it would appear that the understanding of human dignity was of limited significance in classical times. We know that as Rome declined, the influence of the Christian church rose. One of the key thinkers shaping the development of Christian thinking in the first millennium was Augustine of Hippo. In the 5th century, he developed an understanding of humankind arising from our having been made in the image of God. The phrase imago Dei was to shape the thinking of the church for many centuries to come, even down to our own day. We pause in our journey as we come to medieval times to recognize the importance of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He had rediscovered the classics, particularly Aristotle, and so reason played a great part in his thinking. He put reason and imago Dei together. By then, the imago was seen as encapsulating the trinity of memory, intellect, and will. All of these things together gave humanity the capacity of choice, and in particular, the ability to choose to move towards the ultimate goal of union with God, where we will find our true fulfillment. On the other hand, if we choose to move away from God and to sin, then we fall from our dignity. On one occasion, he said this: "By sinning, man departs from the order of reason and consequently falls away from the dignity of his manhood. Hence, although it be evil in itself to kill a man, so long as he preserve his dignity, yet it may be good to kill a man who has sinned, even as it is to kill a beast, for a bad man is worse than a beast." So for Aquinas, dignity is not something innate within us, but a goal to aim for. Man has dignity when he uses his reason and chooses God. But if he goes the other way, he loses that dignity. So dignity in your thinking and in your soul is something you can attain to, rather than something that is innate to your being, however you should choose to live your life. Aquinas continued to shape the thinking of the Roman Catholic Church and is still quite a significant influence in its thinking today. Moving on, the next significant phase is the Renaissance, and more particularly the Reformation. And Luther and Calvin are worthy of mention here. They do not speak of dignity, but do speak often of the imago Dei. Much of their teaching about the human condition was based on our being made in the image of God. But for them, that image is now seen as something that is intrinsic or inherent. Adam was made in the image of God, but when he sinned, he damaged and to an extent broke that image. So our capacity and potential in this life flows from an understanding of our position at creation, a recognition of the impact of the fall, but with the potential for redemption through the Christian gospel. What, if anything, did that mean for an understanding of our relationships as people, social differences, and any equality of rights? Here they diverged. In Germany, ordinary people seized on Luther's teaching that all were equal in God's sight and wanted to apply it in the social and political realm. In 1525, a revolt in Swabia led to the production of 12 articles about people's economic, social, and political rights. Luther, who was dependent upon the support of the German princes for his own position, rejected any secular application of his theology. He disapproved of any use of the gospel to justify the upheaval of the feudal system. I've read that he said this: "This would make all men equal, and that is impossible." So in relation to women and serfdom or slavery, he was in favor of the status quo, and his understanding of human equality was restricted to the spiritual realm. Calvin, however, was more egalitarian. He developed a social and political theory based on the city of God. He understood that people were equal as citizens. He expressed strong views against slavery, although he seems to have been unaware, or at least he doesn't ever mention, the slave trade that was developing at that time. Following on from the Reformation, we come to what is often called the Age of Enlightenment. There was a rising desire to move away from the Thomistic thinking of the Catholic Church and the Protestant thinking of the Reformers. But of course, the search for what it is that gives us worth as human beings did not go away. One of the influential 17th century philosophers was Thomas Hobbes. His approach to that question is interesting. For him, it wasn't what you thought about yourself that mattered, but what other people thought about you and what you thought about them. It's only that that gives you real value, namely the value others put on you. He said, "The public worth of a man, which is the value set on him by the Commonwealth, is what men commonly call dignity. And this value that the Commonwealth assigns to him is shown by offices of command, judicatures, or other public employment, or by names and titles that are introduced to mark out such value." So to Hobbes, your worth is the dignity that others accord to you, arising from your social or other rank. We can recognize this very easily. To an extent, it continues not only in the secular world, but also in the church. We can see it close to home, indeed very close to the home of Vicky, who is chairing this session. She's one of the 4 residentiary canons at York Minster. The statutes of York Minster provide that the Archbishop shall have the principal seat and dignity in the cathedral church. The Dean shall be the principal dignitary of the cathedral next after the Archbishop. The statutes go on to say that 4 residentiary canons shall be appointed by the Archbishop to hold the major dignities, and each holder of a major dignity shall be entitled to have a house. So as I say, this idea is close to home for some. Perhaps the most influential person from the Enlightenment when we think about human worth and dignity is Immanuel Kant. I'm not aware that he ever quoted that view of Hobbes in the sense of specifically setting out to refute what Hobbes said, but he had a very different view. He uses the word worth, as of course had Hobbes, but for him your worth could never be simply your value in the sight of others. Kant said, "The respect I bear others, or which another can claim from me, is the acknowledgement of the worth of another man, i.e. a worth which has no price, no equivalent for which the object of valuation could be exchanged." In another place he said, "Humanity itself is its worthiness." When Kant came to be translated into English, more often than not, the word worth was translated as dignity. Hence, quite a lot of talk about human dignity which takes place in English does refer back to Kant. It's against that background in the church and the secular world that we can look at the period of revolution and independence at the end of the 18th century. The founding fathers in America came out of the Protestant and particularly the Calvinistic side of the Reformation. In 1776, the American Declaration of Independence said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, but among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." In 1789, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen said in Article 6, "All citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations, according to their abilities and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents." But the equality of which each speaks is not what we understand by equality, and was certainly not all embracing. The French use the word dignity, but in the sense of rank. All ranks should be open to all. It was the increasing recognition that distinctions of status and resultant discrimination were not justifiable that led to increasing calls for greater equality in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The rise of socialism, the labor movement, the drive to abolish slavery, and other like campaigns did, however, often refer to human dignity. But it was 89 years after the Declaration of Independence before America passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution and finally abolished slavery in 1865. And in France, it wasn't until 1848 that slavery was finally abolished. Then, of course, the issue of racism, whether in statutory discrimination or simply in institutional prejudice, continued for much longer, and even today, in those 2 countries as elsewhere. Witness the BLM movement arising in America after the death of George Floyd, or the very recent Clive Myrie documentary on the BBC about police racism in France. But we need to return to the Catholic Church and see how it reacted to these developments about equality. The Church was alarmed at what it saw and heard in the secular socialist writing. Not surprising, perhaps, given the hierarchical nature of the Church itself. The Church was keen not only to defend its own hierarchy, but also that of the secular world, recognizing that a challenge outside its doors would quickly lead to challenge within. On the other hand, the Church recognized that its gospel must speak into some of the social injustices, which were highlighted in particular in relation to employment. So it began to call for people to treat each other with dignity and respect within the established order, and for employers to treat their workers well. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical entitled Rerum Novarum, a phrase which means much more than just new things. It does mean revolutionary change. It called on employers to respect the dignity of workers and not to regard them as bondsmen. That dignity, Leo said, arose from the fact that a person is created in the image of God, endowed with free will and an immortal soul. Therefore, respecting the dignity of the person in the workplace required giving them time off to worship God, to fulfill family obligations, and periods of rest and adequate sleep, along with safe working conditions and fair wages. Now, that was in 1891. 40 years later, Pope Pius XI issued his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, which means 40th year. Social issues had moved on, and he was facing totalitarianism dressed on the one hand in National Socialist clothes and on the other hand in communist clothes. Pope Pius also appealed to human dignity and freedom, arguing that issues about them would not be solved by either hostile class confrontation or totalitarian rule. A very influential Catholic thinker at this time, in the first half of the 20th century, was Jacques Maritain. He was very influenced by the writing of Thomas Aquinas and spoke and wrote a great deal about human freedom. For him, there were two elements to that. First, humans were individuals who had a relationship to the common social order of which they were each a part. But then secondly, humans were personal, and each was an object of dignity and must be treated as an end. As individuals, we have obligations to the social order, but as persons, we cannot be subordinated to it. He was French, but after the German invasion of France, he moved to America with his Jewish wife. After the war, he was appointed as the French ambassador to the Vatican, and he also led the French delegation to UNESCO. And although he was not involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, he has been described as its godfather. And it's to that post-Second World War period of history, which has been so significant in our understanding of human rights and dignity, that I now turn. Old empires and alliances and power struggles between them, along with the rise of authoritarian governments, had led to those two dreadful conflicts in which millions of people had died, 15 to 22 million in World War I and 50 to 80 million in World War II. That level of slaughter was inimical to any concept of the flourishing of human dignity, however you regarded dignity. And following the Second World War, there was a determination. And here I quote from the preamble to the UN Charter of June 1945, a determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. And it went on to say that the subscribers reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of every human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. Those words dignity and worth don't reappear in the Charter, which is principally concerned with the establishing of the United Nations. However, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was agreed, and the word dignity was picked up and run with. The first phrase of the preamble to the Declaration reads, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." And then in Article 1, dignity reoccurs. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Further articles say, everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. And everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity. So we can see that human dignity is the very heart of the Declaration. Sadly, there's a dearth of evidence as to exactly how that phrase came to be incorporated into the Charter. There's an anecdote that during one of the drafting sessions, someone expressed astonishment that certain proponents from violently opposed ideologies had agreed on the draft of a list of rights. Yes, came the reply, We agree on those rights, provided we're not asked why. The Canadian diplomat John Humphrey, who was very influential in the drafting, recalled that the debates were dominated by Catholics and communists, with the latter a poor second. But Humphrey himself thought that the phrase human dignity was no more than mere rhetoric. What is clear is that given the history of the development and use of the phrase as we've seen, and its roots in rationalism, Catholicism, and Reformed theology, believers and non-believers of all sorts could see their own philosophical tradition through the lens of the phrase human dignity, and so were willing to accept it as a sound foundation for the rights they were endowing on humanity, even though they knew others had different reasons for doing the same. What is equally clear, however, is that once that phrase had been agreed, it was used very widely thereafter when any state or organization wanted to write a constitution or other foundation document. A typical example is the Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's there in the opening phrase in Article 1. For me, this has similar majestic resonance as does the prologue of John's Gospel. It states, 1. Human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority. 2. The German people therefore acknowledge inviolable and inalienable human rights as the basis of every community of peace and of justice in the world. 3. The following basic rights shall bind the legislature, the executive and the judiciary as directly applicable law. I'll mention also at this point the more recent example of the Hungarian Constitution of 2011 and the revised version in 2013, which state, we hold that human existence is based on human dignity. We'll return to that one in due course. Of course, once you start to write these things into constitutions and statutes, they're then susceptible of interpretation by the courts. In a Canadian case, the Crown against Cap, the Canadian Supreme Court said, human dignity is an abstract and subjective notion, but even with the guidance of the four contextual factors, cannot only become confusing and difficult to apply, it's also proven to be an additional burden on equality claimants rather than the philosophical enhancement it was intended to be. So not very encouraging. And indeed, even in European countries where human dignity is recognized as giving a constitutional basis for rights, the courts have interpreted these provisions very differently. I'm very grateful to Michael Rosen in his book on Dignity, Its History and Meaning for drawing my attention to 3 cases, 1 French and 2 German. One involves dwarfs and 1 hijacked aeroplanes. Monsieur Emmanuel Weckenheim was short of stature, but long in ambition, and he had organized a dwarf tossing competition in Morsange-sur-Orge in France. The proposal was that he, wearing a protective suit, was to be thrown by the competitors, landing on a suitably placed airbed. All of this taking place in the grounds of the local discotheque. This proposal, however, upset the local mayor, who issued an order banning the competition, using his powers to maintain public order and safety, but also saying that in his opinion, such entertainments represented, and I quote, a violation of respect for the dignity of the human person, close quote. Well, Monsieur Weckenheim appealed to the local administrative court. He argued that the evidence on file doesn't show that the banned event was of a nature to disturb public order, peace or health. And even supposing, as the mayor maintains, that the event might have represented a degrading affront to human dignity, a ban could not be legally ordered in the absence of particular local circumstances. The appeal court, the Conseil d'État, took the view that the protection of dignity was another example of the acceptable inclusion of public morality within the definition of public order. They ruled that an attraction of this sort was regarded as infringing the dignity of the human person in its very objective. Its prohibition was thus legal, even in the absence of particular local circumstances. Well, Monsieur Weckenheim appealed to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. Sadly, the committee ducked the issue of dignity and decided the case in relation to discrimination rather than dignity. What's clear from this is that the idea of dignity in any legal sense can produce disagreement and indeed confusion. There's confusion about whose dignity is being infringed, and what, if any, relationship that has to the expression of any rights someone has arising from their having dignity. We move from France to Germany, and from dwarfs flying through the air to planes flying through the air, in particular hijacked planes. Following the terrorist atrocities in 2001, the so-called air safety law was passed. This authorised the state to direct the Air Force to shoot down a hijacked airliner if there were overwhelming reason to believe it would be used as a weapon to cause further casualties. Some people who were not happy about that took the matter to court. And the court ruled that the law was contrary to that basic law we looked at a few minutes ago, in particular because it was a violation of the dignity of the passengers and the crew. Shooting down the hijacked plane would treat its passengers and crew in a way that denied their quality as subjects, and so was contrary to Article 1 of the Basic Law. But you might ask, what of the dignity of the potential targets of the hijackers? The second German case involved the prosecution of a deputy chief of police who'd been investigating the kidnap of a child. And he threatened the suspect that he'd be subjected to severe pain if he didn't reveal where the child was. As a result of that threat, the kidnapper did reveal the hiding place. But one of the outcomes was the prosecution of the deputy chief of police for making that threat. The court decided that what he'd done represented not only a violation of the penal code, but a breach of the dignity clause in Article 1. The court rejected the idea that the dignity of the kidnapper could be weighed against claims made by the dignity of the kidnapped child. But recognizing the extremity he found himself in, the court restricted itself to fining him rather than imprisoning him. What seems to be clear is that it is very difficult to deal with conflicting issues of rights solely on the basis of dignity. Here in England and Wales, and I limit myself to those two countries, not because any views about Scottish nationalism, but because Scotland already does have a separate legal system. But in England and Wales, although human dignity has figured in many cases, it is remarkably absent in the area of crime, which was my area of practice for over 40 years. That's because our courts are concerned to interpret the statutes of England and Wales, and human dignity is not a concept that occurs in any of our criminal statutes. The Human Rights Act 1998 did incorporate the European Convention on Human Rights into English law, and so its articles are applied by the courts. But as the ECHR doesn't itself refer to human dignity, it's a phrase that is rarely used in the courts, and so has not been decisive in English criminal law in any way at all. Here, we look at the specifics without being required to look at any underlying basis, a very English approach. Of course, in countries where the concept of human dignity is incorporated into its constitutional statutes, courts will continue to interpret the phrase, but probably with little consistency. On the wider stage, however, there are other issues that might concern us. Those concerns arise in what we might see as increasingly hyper-partisan politics, both internationally and locally. It was a strong sense of nationalism that in part gave rise to the two world wars, which led people to look for something they could agree upon as a protection against such atrocities occurring ever again. Many are concerned about the increasing levels of nationalism we can see being asserted today. I mentioned the relatively recent Hungarian constitution, which provides that we hold human existence is based on human dignity. One of the issues that has troubled Hungary, and of course not only Hungary, is that of homelessness. And the government of Viktor Orbán wanted to criminalise homelessness, but faced challenges in the courts. The courts initially said that punishing unavoidable living in a public area, as they described it, failed to protect the requirement to protect human dignity. So the government passed an amendment to the constitution to authorise the government to declare homelessness unlawful in order to protect public order, public security, public health, and cultural values. Phrases that are not uncommon to us. And then another amendment to say that using a public space as a habitual dwelling shall be prohibited. Further local laws enable the police to act against people and, if necessary, arrest them. Several judges in the lower court stated that these new regulations infringed human dignity and were wrong for a number of other reasons also. appeals were made to the Constitutional Court, where a number of judges had been removed and replaced by others more favourable to the government agenda. And by a majority, the Constitutional Court stated that the criminalisation and imprisonment of homeless people was not unconstitutional, and people living on the street shall not be protected by the right to human dignity, nor do they share the value of equal dignity. The employment of constitutional rights is dependent on the fulfilment of constitutional duties. I find that all rather chilling. But that's perhaps step one, restricting those who can make a claim based on their human dignity. But there's a step two. Let's look at what's happening currently in China and what China is saying about dignity. China refers regularly to the dignity of the state when challenged about the lack of respect it is said to accord to the dignity of individuals. Back in August 2019, according to the Xinhua news agency, I quote, a central government spokesperson on Sunday strongly condemned the egregious acts of flinging the Chinese national flag into the sea committed by some radical protesters in Hong Kong. It then quoted a government spokesperson saying, their conduct has blatantly offended the state and national dignity, wantonly trampled on the bottom line of the one country, two systems principle, and greatly hurt the feelings of the entire Chinese people, including Hong Kong compatriots. And even more recently, in the summit meetings in Alaska this last March between the States and China, China told the US not to underestimate Beijing's will to safeguard national dignity. One report read as follows. During the talks, China also made it clear to the US that the US should not underestimate China's resolve to safeguard its national sovereignty, security, and development interests, or underrate the Chinese people's determination to safeguard national dignity and justified rights. Have we come full circle? Has the idea of dignity, which was to be the protection of ordinary people, now turned back on them and even begun to devour them? As we look back at our review of the history of the understanding of human dignity and the way that concept now plays out, whether in French and German courts, or as between some states and their citizens, as in Hungary and China, we can see that the same questions have arisen again and again and remain very real questions today. The consensus that emerged and to which people signed up immediately following the Second World War is beginning to break down. As people and states have moved on, and as new political movements have developed, there are new anxieties and new fears on the loose. Some political leaders latch onto those, and cultures of blame and belittling develop to popular acclaim. The safe roots of equal human dignity are torn up, and other dignities greater than the dignity of those who are against the popular and populist leaders are raised up to overbear the individual's dignity. And we find ourselves coming back to ask the questions unanswered in 1948. What is this human dignity? Where does it come from? And we revisit the history we've been examining. Is it reason or rank? Something to aspire to, or is it inherent? And if so, how do we understand it? Is it a thing of itself? Does it have objectivity? If it's objective, how do you balance the objective dignities of people who want different things? And how does the individual's dignity fare when set against such dignity as that of the state or other corporate body? In the 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer said that the concept of the dignity of man as developed by Kant was, quote, the shibboleth of all the perplexed and empty-headed moralists who conceal behind that imposing expression their lack of any real basis of morals, or at any rate one that had any meaning. We've seen that running through this philosophical debate, the underlying question is, what is it that gives meaning to humankind as a species, and also to each of us individually? That's clearly not something that is capable of being identified or proved by any scientific methodology. It's ultimately a matter of faith. The manner and object of that faith will be determined by your wider worldview. Those with a religious frame will be likely to see these types of meaning arising from our having a relationship with God, a God who made us, and that it's through our creaturehood we find our place and station in this world, and so can embrace a dignity flowing from that. Such people will then usually look to their holy books for other guidance about what that means in how we should regard and treat each other. Monotheistic faiths basically say that all are equal. However, it has to be conceded that sometimes the interpretation of their scriptures produces a state where some are more equal than others. Those without such religious frame must take what seems to me to be a greater leap of faith. Often they will rely on such arguments as those of Cicero, that we have reason, and that is what sets us apart from other species, and so we have meaning and dignity. Or for some, it's the Kantian approach, that because we can decide things for ourselves and do shape our own lives, we have worth and meaning. But how do you then have any clear route to decide questions of fairness and equality? How do you balance the rights of one person against another, or of one person against a state? How do you decide whether to ban a dwarf tossing competition or whether to shoot down a hijacked aeroplane? These questions have been there since our forebears began to communicate with one another. Ultimately, we will each answer the questions for ourselves about our own personal meaning and relationships. But I don't think I've concealed my anxieties about the apparent breaking down of what had been a post-war consensus about bigger questions of what that means for the relationship between the individual and organized society, and how those questions should be addressed. In 1948, emerging from the horrors of the wars they had experienced, they knew what they had to do and what they should not do to move forward and rebuild a world in peace. So they agreed on the rights and were glad not to be asked why. Now there isn't always agreement about those rights, and we are back to the question, why?
Peter, you've led us through a fascinating historical, theological, and philosophical journey looking at issues relating to human dignity and how human beings treat one another. Do you think that over time the human race has made any progress at all? Presumably, this is something we haven't yet got right.
Well, obviously, human has made progress in many areas as we've increasingly understood the world and how it works. We make tools and things like that. And technologically, the changes that have taken place in my lifetime are beyond my wildest imagining as a child. But I think the basic patterns of human relationships, our feelings about one another and how we treat one another, doesn't really seem to have moved on a great deal. People's understanding about how relationships should be conducted and or governed doesn't seem to have changed a great deal over the centuries. Wars still take place between tribes and between nations, but we can now kill people more efficiently.
So, Peter, do you think there is something absolutely essential about human dignity to which we now need to return?
Well, I talked about the different meanings that dignity has had over the years, over the centuries, and many of them are related to valuing and attributing worth to other people. But what is that? Is it rank or status? That's still there. And there's still a habit to accord dignity to people who are older, more senior perhaps in the workplace. But there's also that strain of thought that each person has their own dignity, which is as equal as the next person's. That has grown over time, but there's still, I think, a great deal more work we need to do on that.
Are you saying that measuring human worth is quite a dangerous human propensity? And in that vein, do you think there is anyone who cannot or should not be accorded some kind of dignity?
The use of the word measure suggests differentiating. You're worthy because you've got something that somebody else hasn't got, or you've done something somebody else hasn't done, so you're of more or less value than somebody else or than some other group. And that's what I think is dangerous. Obviously, there are differences between us in the things that we can do. You can sing in a way that I can't. And so you can do things in a way but that functions in that activity rather than the relative value in terms of rank or price. The Bible, the Apostle Paul uses the image of the body, which has many different parts, and some are visibly more obvious, but the invisible parts are equally essential to the functioning of the body. And if we apply that to spheres of employment or politics, I think it could have a very profound impact. some changes would certainly be called for.
It could be quite incredible to think of a world where everyone is valued as a member of the human family. That would be something to which I think we should aspire. You've taken us through a fairly westernized view of human dignity through the ages. Are there challenges to this kind of view from other world cultures? And how do we balance this westernized view of what dignity is with our shameful past, which includes colonialism, slavery, war, and oppression? So my question really is, how do we speak of human dignity without hearing the voices of all human beings and acknowledging our own history and diminishing that? What can we learn from other cultures in our world today about human dignity?
Gosh, that's a very interesting, challenging question. And I'm not particularly qualified to hold forth for very long about worldviews outside the Western one that I've grown up with. But the little I know about, say, Eastern religions suggests that they're really working with the same concepts as we do in the West. So there's rank, there's that sort of inherent worth. Hinduism, for example, has a caste system, so rank is significant there in relation to valuing people. You have to recognize and you have duties towards people in other castes than your own. At the same time, they do believe that all human beings have the same essence, and that in Buddhism, I think, is a very large part of their understanding about the life stream that flows through everything, and not just through people, but through things as well. But they also see me as having that ability to choose my path in life, to choose that path to self-perfection. And that, if we just think back to what I said about Aquinas and people being able to choose to move towards God, these are not dissimilar things. Part of your question was about the extent to which our past is something that we might be ashamed of because we have not valued other people, and that's certainly true. We have regarded them as less than us, not having the same dignity as us, and that I think is something that we, I hope, have turned from, but need to go on turning away from.
If I take you back to issues around sort of spirituality and faith again, can you reflect with us a little more on dignity as worth? That word worth is something that we recognize in the Christian tradition because it's the origin of where we get the term worship. So in our tradition, we ascribe worth to God through our worship. Jesus said, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Is there something we can all learn about to whom or to what we each ascribe worth in our own lives?
Well, from the Christian perspective, our primary relationship, primary reference point is with God, who is the creator and redeemer, and so is worthy of being at the center of everything that I am and everything that I do. And our lives should therefore be full of thankfulness to God, but well, we also recognize there's an awful lot that isn't right, stuff that's wrong, stuff that I've done wrong. And so I also bring into that relationship with God confession, acknowledgement of my wrongdoing, lament about the other things that are causing pain to others. And all of that's part of my conscious life with God. And if I'm keeping my relationship with God healthy in that way, that will inform how I deal with everyone else. My recognition that they are fundamentally in the same position as me before God will affect how I treat them. I think that's how I would see worth, the worthiness of God and the worth of my fellow human beings as people also made in his image as I am.
And do you think there is a difference then between a secular notion of human dignity and valuing our humanity and a religious notion?
Well, part of my premise is that the secular notion, quoting Schopenhauer, was that the idea of dignity and worth is a meaningless shibboleth. It simply means what you want it to mean. It's a peg which you can hang anything on. If we go back to the Eastern world, I recently read an essay by a member of the Faculty of International Law and Human Rights in Kathmandu in Nepal. And his argument is that human rights is a very much a post-World War II concept, and that many of the ancient civilizations and religions in Asia have long-standing general and existing concepts about welfare and security, and they do fit well with the concepts that we have been talking about in terms of people's rights since World War II. But what he says is that a review of our Western standards in the light of those long-standing Eastern standards might be a benefit to everyone. So I think that the difference between secular and religious is perhaps not a very strong divide, but the recognition that there are different concepts, as there have been throughout time, so there are across the globe.
Do you think there's anything we could do to move beyond the language of human rights towards something more like human flourishing?
Well, I think it's often said by people, all this emphasis on human rights forgets everybody's responsibilities. And rights are only one aspect of it. And of course, those rights, particularly those rights post-Second World War, were very much expressing the rights of individuals as against the totalitarian state. So I think that's where we need to understand that. But I agree with you that human flourishing is perhaps a much better objective for us to have in terms of what we want to achieve, whether it's personally or as a group or as a nation. We should look to see the flourishing of all.
I'm going to take us now beyond individual or community or even nation and talk about humanity as a global community. So in terms of dignity beyond even the human sphere and our part in creation as a whole, can you reflect on how we give dignity to the whole of the creation of which we are made, of which we're part? Does it deserve dignity? And also, how does this relate to the way we perhaps treat our fellow creatures as part of that creation, whether sentient or not?
Well, if dignity does mean worth, then yes, the rest of the order around us in which we live has worth because it's a creation made by God. And I have a particular role in that created order. The Bible tells me that when God put Adam into that garden, he put him there to tend it, to care for it as a responsible steward. I think sometimes the idea of domination or words to that effect has sometimes been used by religious people, justifying that on the basis of what's said in Genesis 1:26, where it says God gave Adam dominion over the other creatures. But I think now, as we've understood more about how the world works, we've got a real responsibility to come back to see ourselves as stewards of it, because there are resources that are decreasing and there are other dangers and damage that are prevalent. You mentioned of sentient beings. Well, the Queen's speech just a few weeks ago spoke about the government's intention to do things in relation to sentient beings. And that takes us into interesting territory. We've got to work out what it means to have respect for creation, what it means to be responsible stewards. What does that mean in terms of food production and consumption? And of course, you can get into discussions about vegetarianism and all sorts of other things. But ultimately, we have a responsibility to live as stewards in this world, taking care of it, leaving it better than we found it.
So if we could move from domination to dignity, that would certainly reflect that approach in how we look to creation and care for it. Human beings have amazing gifts towards science and technology and creating new things ourselves. So with the advancement of science and technology, which is moving rapidly week by week, can you foresee challenges to our understanding of human dignity arising out of that. So when does something that we develop or that we create as an artificial intelligence, for example, become something to which we then ascribe worth and also dignity?
Well, the advance of science and technology has enabled us both to manage, but also, as I was saying, to damage the planet quite significantly. But as I said earlier, it hasn't helped us to have very different views about how we should live than our forebears had. I think artificial intelligence is definitely your area of expertise rather than mine. And I think some of the possibilities in that area can be quite frightening. I recall listening some while ago on the radio, I think a couple of years ago, to a program talking about artificial intelligence, but demonstrating how much of the working out of that was dependent on the people who created a particular item and depended on their worldview, because that will be reflected in the sort of questions that they posed through as it were, the algorithms and so on. But I think my bottom line would be that as those made by God to have that responsible stewardship of the world, we can harness technology in that objective. But any responsibility remains ours, and we must never lose sight of that. These things, including artificial intelligence, are tools that we make to enable us to live. But the bottom line is the type of life we're wanting help in living. And that's our responsibility to take responsibility for that.
And I suppose it's a thought experiment really at the moment, but who knows how far we'll get towards reality. If human beings create an artificial intelligence, if you like, in our own image, and we make the computer programs to enable this intelligence to think and react and live in our world, how does such an intelligence become framed by morals, dignity, all that kind of stuff? I think those are the questions that I think people in the area of AI are interested in asking. Would these artificial intelligences just become as potentially damaging as human beings can be to each other? I suppose that's the question. If we make things in our own image, where does that take us? It's a science fiction question almost, but
that's the point, isn't it? We're making things in our image. Now, we've been made in God's image. That image is now slightly flawed. So when we make things in our image, they're going to be things ultimately that have the flaws that we've got within them, I think. I may be wrong about that, I don't know. But yes, it's very interesting. But as I say, I think it is more your scientific area than it is mine.
Moving us on to a different kind of perspective, the last year, the whole world globally has journeyed through a catastrophic global pandemic, and that has exposed many challenging issues which relate to how we all perceive human dignity and worth. So as we have journeyed through the last year, and you've seen the news as I have day by day, and all the tragic loss of life that we've experienced, and the way that life is or perhaps isn't valued. What have your reflections been as you've journeyed through this really difficult year on this kind of subject?
Okay, I suppose at this moment in time, my sort of first reaction, and with all the stuff that's going on politically, is to say, well, it's very easy to talk the talk and much harder to walk the walk. We talk about the value of those who've cared for us and served us and looked after us, whether in the health service or the delivery drivers, but we're not going to allow that to impact on how much we pay them, or for those who are not British born, how easily we should let them stay here among us. And a lot of attention is currently being focused on the whole care sector, particularly the elderly and others with long-term needs. But it doesn't seem that that's a high priority in terms of certainly government priorities to change how that is all organised, run and paid for. My mother died just over a year ago, and she was in a care home, and I'd not been able to visit her for the 6 weeks before she died. She was almost 99, and so each time I had visited her before they were locked down, I'd said goodbye, conscious it might be the last time. So I did feel that I'd had some opportunity to say goodbye to her after a fashion. And I know that many others have had much harder times with their own losses. But I think clearly this year has made us all face our mortality, think carefully about what we're doing in our lives. But I think what's going to be very interesting is if we kind of moved on a year from now, see what sort of differences there will be in both the patterns of living and the values that we've got and how we're treating families and people, those in the care professions, and all those sorts of things.
Thank you. Some people say that we live in an increasingly atomized culture. Do you think individualism and consumerism challenge the idea of human dignity?
Well, by atomized, I'm understanding you to mean a collection of self-interested, self-sufficient people sort of acting sort of separately. As I say, I'm not a scientist, but my understanding, very basic understanding about science, is that any bit of stuff has lots of atoms in it floating around, banging into each other. I seem to remember that phrase from early learning, but I'm sure that scientific reality is actually very different from that. But the idea of us all banging into each other, whether personally or internationally, does reflect how I see much of human activity. And that obviously challenges the idea of human dignity that people are just being banged into.
And if I take us from there into another kind of human community, if we think about, for example, the rule of St. Benedict, and about how monastic communities, as an example, live together. And there are some wonderful examples within that rule about the abbot of the community always referring to the youngest or the newest in that community to gauge their opinion and counsel, just as much as he might refer to the oldest and the perceived wisest or most mature. So although there is a kind of hierarchy in a monastic community, in a sense, there's also this great sense of equality. So I wonder if you can reflect about the human community as a place where human dignity is tested and lived out.
Well, that is exactly the place where it's lived out and where it is tested in community. And the monastic communities were designed really to provide a place where people could live as they understood they were made to live. They weren't for one moment suggesting everybody should move into such communities, but they were there as an example and a resource for others. But the rules that underlay how they operated, I think, do have quite a lot to teach us. That example you give shows that dignity was not just a matter of rank or seniority, but it was recognized that each person had their own gifts, their own skills, their own contribution to make. And that being recognized was actually given space to be put into effect. So if the community was to benefit from all those skills and gifts, you had to look widely across the body of people in order to, as it were, gather in all that fruit. And I think that that there's a lot that we can learn from that about how we make sure we've got all the best possible information before decisions are made, that we, as it were, want to listen to those who we might naturally think don't have anything to say, but perhaps they do. Yes, I think there's a lot we can learn from that pattern.
Now a question, a bit of a cheeky question in a way. Peter, I introduced you at the beginning of this talk as His Honour Canon Peter Collier QC. And I wanted to ask you about your reflections on dignity and deference. This is something actually very serious that the church is grappling with at the moment. There is a difference, isn't there, between giving dignity and giving deference. And I think it relates to power and authority, that you might want to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, you refer to the title that I'm still allowed to use, which is His Honour. When, in fact, I was working, because of my particular level and because of the size of the court, being the senior judge in that court centre, I was addressed as my lord, not only in court, but also by staff behind the scenes. And sometimes my wife would overhear conversations on the hands-free phone when we were traveling somewhere. The listing officer might ring and would be addressing me as my lord, and she would say to me afterwards, "What is that all about?" But there is a difference, I think, between an organization that will have a structure and that will have some level of leadership, giving a recognition to that. But it's very easy to be caught up in all of that and to allow it to affect you so that you do see yourself as being different in some fundamental way, when in fact you are no different. And I did learn and try to put into practice a number of things in order to try and deal with that and to counter that. And I always found it was very helpful, if you're wanting to bring any change into the organization, to sit around the table, all the people who are involved, and to say, we're all here as equals, we all have exactly the same thing to contribute, because we all have a part to play in how this all works out. And it was only when you actually did that, that you did actually produce a system of change that would work. Moving to the church, I can discern a similar pattern. Bishops are diocesan bishops are addressed as my lord. All bishops are addressed as bishop, and in committees and meetings they're usually addressed as bishop or bishop X, and that does do something to the relationships of the people sitting around the table. And it's quite a distance from the Benedictine example that you were speaking about a few minutes ago. I don't know how the abbot would have been addressed, but there was a relation by the abbot that everybody had a contribution to make. And I think that the church has still got a long way to go, because I think that the deference can lead to all sorts of issues and problems. It's been highlighted in relation to the covering up of abuse and things of that sort. And we need to have a much greater recognition of our common humanity, of our equivalence and equality as people before God in the church, if we're actually going to be able to live out the sort of life that Jesus showed us.
Thank you. I'm going to, for the final question, take us back in a sense to the beginning, if I may. From a Christian perspective, the Imago Dei, being made in the image of God, should mean that we give worth and dignity to the image of God in others. This is a challenge for Christians, as you've highlighted, as much as it is for anyone else. So finally, Peter, from your own faith perspective, and also perhaps based on your work and your experience, how do you approach this issue and actually live it out day by day?
Yeah, well, going back to what I was just talking about in terms of when I was daily at work, I tried to reflect that understanding of the dignity of all of those I was working with and dealing with in practical ways. So colleagues, the professional lawyers who came to court, the court staff, those who are accused of crime, those who are the victims of crime, other professionals, the police, prison officers, probation officers, and so on, all of those, I hope I recognized as individual people made in God's image, fellow members of the human race, with a dignity of their own and deserving of being treated with dignity. And I hope I treated them that way. It was certainly my prayer and my intention. It had some practical outworkings. I mean, sometimes you see the headlines of what the judge says when passing sentence. I hope you'll never find a headline where I said to somebody, you are an evil and wicked person. I might have said what you did was evil or wicked, but I would not speak to somebody about them in that way. And it seemed that was an important difference to me. Other practical things, I'd try and go and see people in their rooms rather than expect them always to come to me, work with an open door to give the message that I was available and approachable. And there are all sorts of ways like that where you are trying to recognize and to say and to actually live out the fact that I have a dignity of mine, but you have a dignity of your own. And there needs to be a respect for that dignity and a recognition of who each of us are before the God who made us.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this amazing conversation. It's been a real privilege to hear you and to hear you reflect and to converse with you in this way. I'm now going to draw. Thank
I
you.
could say thank you very much for challenging me and taking me further than I think I might otherwise have gone in some of these things.
Happy to oblige. I'm now going to draw this this evening to a close, and also offer thanks to you on behalf of all those who've been watching, and thank all those who've been watching for joining us as well. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website. And as I mentioned at the start of the event, this event is part of our Being Human series, which delves into the nature of humanity. The first talk in this series was Science, Religion and Humanity, Who Gets to Say?, which you can watch again on the festival YouTube channel after the festival ends. And concluding the series will be Holiness and Desire, What Makes Us Who We Are, on Thursday the 17th of June, and tickets are still available from the festival website. Good night and thank you for watching.